Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shipley's webinar today on the art of storytelling. I'm Mallory Price, and I will monitor today's session. And joining me are Sam Singh from Shipley, India, Paige Frame from McKinnon Mulheron, and Brad Douglas from Shipley Global. We're so happy you could all join us, and we hope that you have as much fun as we had preparing this webinar. Also, thank you to those of you who submitted questions at registration. Those questions really help us prepare this webinar and make it something that you need. And if you have questions during the webinar, please type those into the questions tab on your control panel, and we will get to as many as we can. So the agenda for today, we are going to start out by talking about storytelling. And what is storytelling? And then we are going to talk about how storytelling is used and how to use that in your proposals. Why storytelling is impactful for those proposals. How does it relate to proposals? Storytelling and procurement trends and how they interact. Applying storytelling in your proposal messaging. And then we will summarize it all and have a question and answer at the end, and any further discussion topics we want to bring up, we will wrap it all up at that point. So to start out, since this is a webinar about storytelling, we have a little story we'd like to tell. Now, maybe some of you have heard this story. I actually heard this story when I was in elementary school, and I have remembered it for all of these years because I don't know, for some reason it connected with me, and maybe it will connect with you too. So once upon a time, there was an earl of a little place called Sandwich. And this earl liked to play cards. But the problem was he also liked to snack while he played cards and didn't have the availability to use a fork and knife to cut anything if he was going to hold the cards in his hand as well. So he asked to be brought a piece of salted beef between two pieces of toasted bread so that he could have his snack in one hand and his cards in the other and not have to relinquish one or the other. Now, because this man is named the Earl of Sandwich, other people would say, hey, I'll have what Sandwich is having. And after a while, people would say, I'll have the sandwich. So you can see our very basic rendition there in the upper right-hand corner of, the Earl's sandwich might have been slightly tastier than that one there. But this story as a child connected with me because I ate sandwiches almost every day.
All those years, you still remember.
I still remember.
Okay.
And not only did I eat sandwiches, but I liked to play games. And that's what the Earl did. So that's why I remember this story and why it connected with me. So what is storytelling? Stories have been told for a very long time. They are a very timeless way to communicate. They've been told a long time, and I believe they will be told for a very long time. For example, I'm sure you've all heard of the Iliad or the Odyssey, and those stories were even told well before they were ever written down. They were passed along just verbally for a very long time, and we still know those stories today and still talk about them. I'm sure everyone has heard the term Trojan horse, which comes from the Iliad. So good stories, and even the best stories, use multiple senses. You will read, you'll see pictures, you'll hear them, and you'll connect with them emotionally. A good story also states, supports, and summarizes, meaning you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every single story has this. Whether it's fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter. Those are three elements that every story will always have. So we wanted to discuss also the science of storytelling. Why does this actually work? Well, humans have been telling stories since cave paintings. I mean, some of the very first people wanted to write their stories down, but they did it through pictures. And even today, we consider it a fundamental method of communication. Good storytelling also appeals to both logic and emotion. So, for example, when you read a story, it will connect with you emotionally because it's logical to you. So in proposals, if you connect with something your customer needs, you appeal to their logic and their emotions simultaneously. Stories also allow us to, as I mentioned earlier, but to connect and engage with the information. As human beings, we absolutely want to relate. For example, going back to this story of the sandwich, this lovely origin story, I remember a couple of years after I heard that in elementary school, my little brother came home from school and said, "Guys, today I learned about how the sandwich was invented." And he and I were able to connect because we had a similar story in a similar situation with that story. We all want to connect, we all want to relate, and stories help us do that. Our brains themselves even become more active when we tell stories and read them because they appeal on so many different senses, just like we talked about earlier. They appeal to us emotionally and we are connecting with each other, so our brains become more active and it makes the story stick. So why is storytelling so impactful? For one, stories gain and hold our attention. For example, I am a very avid reader, and sometimes I can't choose which book I want to read next. And so I will read the first couple of pages of both books to determine which one will capture my attention more, and that's the one I choose to read. And I'm pretty sure evaluators probably work about the same way. They're going to keep reading the ones that capture their attention.
So you're saying they might not read the whole thing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And so with that in mind too, when a story gains and captures your attention, you're creating an emotional connection with that story. And when they have an emotional connection, that actually builds trust. There is, in the brain, so kind of going back to the science, but in the brain, when you make an emotional connection with something, it releases a chemical that builds trust with whatever connection you're making. And when you build that trust, it helps your customer and your evaluator remember you. And that moves the reader or the audience to action, which then advances the sale because you have created this stickiness. So Brad, I know you know a lot about this stickiness. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah. Mallory's put up here a cover to a book that, by the way, thanks for this introduction, Mallory. And this book that I really like goes back several years, but it's called Made to Stick. And it was by a couple of brothers that went to Stanford University, Chip and Dan Heath. And the information is so relevant to those of us who are involved really in any aspect of business, or especially in business development, whether it be selling or capture management, proposals. The ideas that they share, and the whole premise here is what they're subtitled, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. And a big part of their whole concept here in the book is storytelling and creating sound bites. And like Mallory said, the emotional connection, something people can relate to. So what we've done is we've taken a few excerpts from this book, not promoting the book, obviously, but just a couple of ideas that are relevant to this topic and some of the questions that you all submitted when you registered. For example, Chip and Dan say, for an idea or story, in this case, to endure, we have to generate interest and curiosity. And for those of you who maybe have been through Shipley training, you understand we teach a lot about going beyond just compliance to a request in our proposal response and really getting responsive, getting to the underlying, under the surface need. That creates interest and curiosity for the customer, the evaluator. And then they go on to say in the book later, they say naturally sticky ideas are full of concrete images. And then we put in parentheses stories, because our brains are wired to remember concrete data, things we can relate to. Another quote from the book, sticky ideas. Okay, we want to become sticky to the customer in a good way, not in a painful way, but sticky ideas have to carry their own credentials. We need ways to help people test our ideas for themselves, our solutions, kind of a try before you buy philosophy. So in our proposals, if we're giving our customers, our evaluators, our prospective customers, this try before you buy experience, in other words, they read our sections, they read our content, they feel like they've tried it because we've given them so much validation. That could be past performance examples, and we'll talk a little bit later about success stories, testimonials. So this idea of if we're good at weaving our story, our message, our win themes throughout our proposals, we will create that sense of try before you buy for the customer that Chip and Dan mentioned. And then one last quote from their book is that, and they talk a lot about how we can succeed in conveying messages that stick. And they say news reporters are taught to start with stories with the most important information. So they start with the most important information. The first sentence, which is called the lead, contains the most essential elements of the story. After the lead, then information is presented in decreasing order of importance. So this is exactly what we need to do in all of our customer communication, not just proposals. Whether it's an email, a cover letter, a sales briefing, a demonstration, we need to take this advice from Made to Stick, from Chip and Dan, and always lead with the most important, most relevant information. So in our storytelling, in our theme statements, in our messaging, this becomes really, really critical. So I just wanted to share that. We thought that really applied to this topic, and they go on and give other examples of memorable, well, just like you, Mallory, for years, you remembered that story clear back from elementary school, and I think we all can relate to that. You know, there's certain metaphors or stories that really have had an impact and shaped us to some degree. One last thing from Chip and Dan, our messages, our stories have to be compact, because we learn and remember only so much information at once. And so we can't go on and on and on. The message, people lose interest, let's face it. You know, we've all got very short attention spans, including our evaluators nowadays. So, you know, our messages have to be very compact and to the point. That's how our brains operate. So that, I thought, was just a really helpful piece of information that I remember from studying that book several years ago.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Paige, would you tell us a little bit about the effective uses of storytelling?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about some times when it would be a good time to use storytelling. And I would argue that anytime you've got any piece of communication, that it could benefit from storytelling. So we've got a couple examples here for you. Even in casual discussions, preparing your elevator speech, it can be it can be a much more compelling story, something people will remember if you can turn it into a story. So rather than just saying, here's what I do for a living, or here's what our company does, if you can turn it into an interesting story that says how you actually got there, why you're passionate about it, and give a little beginning, middle, end story, it's easier for people to retain that and remember it and keep you in mind. Another way is through training. Telling people of your past experiences or war stories can be helpful. And I think, Sam, would you mind jumping in and giving us some example from your history on war stories?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. I mean, the thing to remember is facts tell while stories sell. And we never start a story in a training by saying, let me tell you a story, because a lot of times that could put people off. I had a CFO in one of my workshops, and I made the mistake of saying, let me tell you a story. And he said, we don't pay you guys money to tell us stories. We're busy people. So if we think about stories, we really want to just get straight into it. On the way here, I was at the airport, my flight was late, and I met a gentleman who was a salesperson. It was late at night, and whenever I meet a salesperson, my eyes always light up. And I asked him, what do you sell? And he said, I sell hydraulic industrial equipment. Wow, how's business? It's booming. How is your pricing with your competitors? Well, it's 3 times more expensive. Hey, what's the secret? 3 times more expensive and business is booming? And I said, we don't sell. We give customers a business case. I'll give you an example. So we went and saw a Pepsi bottling plant, and the Pepsi bottling plant, every single Pepsi bottle was overfilling by 10 mil. They said, you do the maths, how much money literally they were throwing down the drain. We went with a business case, and the plant director said, could you airlift that and get that in, because the business case stacked up. And that's an example of really getting the point across of how important the value proposition is, because the business case overcomes the argument to say, hey, you know, you're too expensive, because you're too expensive compared to what? And that's how these guys got business. Interestingly, Apple didn't create digital music, but Steve Jobs used a great line, and many of you may know this, I'll put 1,000 songs in your pocket. And did he do that? So if you're a trainer, have a few stories up your sleeve that can connect with the audience. And what I'd suggest is also have a library based on culture. I was in the Middle East, and some of the stories I was telling there completely fell flat. So we need to think of a regional variance where something may be funny or grabbing attention to a US audience may not necessarily do so with an audience in the Middle East or maybe an audience in Britain. More later.
Great, thank you, Sam. That's super helpful. And in the same vein of training, also management leadership. So when you are leading a team and explaining how to do things, giving people a story to help solidify and remember those pieces can be super helpful. Another time when you might be using storytelling would be in your everyday life. And I think that we do this a lot more than we might even realize it. It kind of makes me laugh to think about how often we do this with specifically kids, that even just recently we were telling my 3-year-old for the first time the story about the boy who called wolf. And you think about this story and how silly it is that we're still talking about I don't think a lot of us are living on farms with sheep and watching out for wolves, and yet even little kids understand the point of that story and remember the moral behind it. So just as Mallory said, for years and years, since the beginning of time, we've been using stories to help teach a lesson, solidify it, remember these good stories. And then the last 4 that we've got up here kind of all go together, that when you're doing proposing or prospecting for new business, negotiating, selling, just like we've been talking about, when you're giving them something to remember, then not only is it solidifying in their head what you can do for them, but it also makes it easier to remember in a way that they can then repeat it and sell it to either themselves as they continue to think about it, or sell it to the other people on their team. And so not only are you doing them making it easier for them to understand what you're providing, but you're really making their life easier, because it's easier to evaluate, it's easier to imagine them in your shoes or in their own shoes with you helping them out, and also makes it easier for them to sell it within their own organization because they've internalized that story and can repeat it. So all these different ways, we might not even realize that we're doing it sometimes, but giving people a story to hold on to remember, to better understand what we're explaining, proposing, or selling really helps them. It makes their life easier, and it makes it easier for us to explain what we're doing as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. I really like the idea that if your customer can repeat your story, then you probably did a good job of clearly conveying your message. So thank you both. Those were really, really excellent. So a word of caution, good storytelling does not fabricate authenticity, it validates authenticity. So in your proposals, we don't want you to make up stories about your company. We want you to use these stories to validate what you can do. Storytelling has a unique way of building trust when you use them for authenticity. Okay, so Brad, could you tell us a little bit about leadership and storytelling?
Yeah, and this was on, I think, the screen that Paige was discussing, leadership and management. And so wanted to spend just a little bit of time on this topic, knowing that some of us on this webinar are in leadership or management roles. But it is important, as in any management or leadership role, that we be good storytellers. And like you said, Mallory, we're not fabricating, but it's a way to convey and build information and build trust. So I pulled up the example here of Stephen R. Covey, and we know he passed away a few years ago. And the reason this came to mind for me was in our company history here at Shipley, for a period of years, we were actually part of the Franklin Covey organization. And so for those 3 years or so, I became very familiar with Dr. Covey's content, his methods, his approach to writing and presenting. You know, he well known. I'm sure all of us have heard of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So I don't have to tout that. But here's the reason this is relevant to this topic for me, at least. And it's the idea that great leaders are great storytellers, because with every habit that Dr. Covey would present on or talk about or write about, there was always a main story or metaphor. And he did it in a way that it's very hard to forget. So, you know, his first habit, for example, is be proactive. You know, he talks about how we have a choice. And we have a choice, and then there's consequences to that choice. So it's be proactive. Habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. You know, have a goal, have a vision, foresight. But the one I wanted to focus on really was the one I remember most, which was habit 3, and that is put first things first. And I remember this so well, and it's so ingrained in me because of the story. And I'm guessing many of you on this webinar have watched this, seen it, heard it, or read about it. When he's presenting a seminar, he brings someone up from the audience, and then he does this demonstration of big rocks, little rocks. And he has them pour in all the little gravelly rocks into a jar or a container. And the little rocks represent the little petty things we do all day. You know, the way we, you know, chip away at our day with little unimportant things. The big rocks represent the really important things in our life or in our work. And his point is, if we fill up our jar with all these little insignificant pebbles, we don't have room in the jar for the big rocks, the important things. Get into his habit, you know, put first things first, the things that really matter. If we put the big rocks, the most important things, if we take care of those in our work, in our life, in our selling, in our business development, then the little things can fill in the gaps, and we'll get everything in the container and it'll work out. So I know it's maybe an overused metaphor and story and analogy, but boy, did it, at the time I first heard it, and it really resonated. So a great leader, wherever we are, a great manager, we can take examples in our lives or stories that we've heard or success stories with customers and bring that to our customers in a way that they will remember and they won't forget. So just a way that an important validation, I think, that storytelling, sharing experiences and success stories really are memorable and really can matter.
Excellent. I like that too, because earlier you mentioned putting the most important topics in your proposal up front too.
Yeah.
So putting those big rocks, those big things in first, and letting the little pieces fill in around it.
Yeah.
I like that. Sam, could you tell us a little bit about storytelling in business development?
Yeah, sure. A lot of times, organizations, I've seen salespeople constantly talking about themselves. And one of my favorite pastimes, much to the chagrin of my good lady wife, is I invite double glazing or window salespeople to my home, and I visit car showrooms on a regular basis just to look at the techniques that all the salespeople use. And they get to a point and then they start insulting the customer because they're under pressure to sell. Now imagine if we didn't have that pressure to sell and we really wanted to solve the problem. And one of the things about business development story is to start with a similar story. A lot of times when we go to a customer or a prospect and we start by asking a question, they may not want to answer something. They may say, no, we everything's fine here. Everything's cool here. Have you ever been to a prospect? The meeting is there and then they don't want to talk, or whatever, the mood has changed. So one way in saying is that recently a CIO called us. She was having this problem and they asked us to have a look at this. So by using a similar story, that gets people going. Let me give an example. A lot of times, negative stories brings in more complaint. For example, if I told you, hey guys, I was traveling on United Airlines, and I could tell you that was one of the worst flights in my life. What would generally the reaction be? Would you all come and defend United Airlines? Or generally you'd say, if you thought that was bad, let me tell you how bad it was for me. So in business development, it's a good idea to research the customer and have a story with a job role. And I just did that today. I was speaking to the head of pre-sales for a technology company, and I did a cookery demonstration where I said, a lot of times with clients we've worked with, an RFP arrives and then they hit the panic button and they think, how do we answer the questions? Quick, go call job logs and get job logs. Well, he's free. Get him on the project because he's free. And there starts the whole process of how they write a proposal. Now, I'm not saying this is the way it is in your organization, but here's what happened recently with a similar customer. And suddenly he opened up and he said, you know what, that's exactly what we do. And we got the attention, and he said, when can you guys get started? The other thing also to bear in mind is if we have somebody who's not engaging, is to close with a question. Would it help if you and your team could write a proposal that grabbed the attention of your customer so that you are the organization that can solve the problem? If you were to be able to do that, would it help? And a closing question at the end of a story would grab the attention. Over to you, Mallory.
Hey, thank you, Sam, and thank you for all of your stories. Okay, so how does storytelling relate specifically to proposals? Paige, could you address that for us?
Sure. Let's see. So first of all, we've talked about this a little bit about how a proposal is a sales document. And I think we've got another slide. Here we go. Okay, great. So just as we were talking about and how this story can help sell whatever you are proposing or trying to explain, that a proposal can use a story to help you make that memorable, make it clear what you're offering. One main, very important thing to remember, we mention this a lot just in proposal writing in general, but it's true for storytelling as well, and combining the two, it's of course true that we need to keep our customer and our audience, our reader, our listener in mind when we are writing this story, writing this proposal. So really figuring out what's important to them, what they will relate to. Like Sam mentioned, knowing your audience and not telling them a story that's going to fall flat, that's going to kind of put you back a step. So making sure that that you know your audience, know what they're looking for, and then customize your story and your proposal for them, and not just for yourself and what you're proposing. And really doing that is going to make it easier for them to evaluate and make it relevant for them to know if you're really meeting their needs and responding to everything that they've requested. One thing that I think is really a great idea and very cool if you can do it is to come up with your overarching story that can be weaved throughout your proposal. So really figuring out what that story is that's going to be compelling and relevant for your customer, and then making sure that you're bringing it up throughout the proposal so that you have that repetition throughout. And as Brad talked about, you've got that stickiness, that you're reminding them of the story, you're showing how the different pieces relate back to that and how all of it is relevant in how you're going to meet the customer's needs. And in the same way of being relevant, you want to make sure that your story isn't just a story for entertainment, but that it really solidifies and validates the claims and that you're making and shows proof that it's saying not only are we saying we can do this, but we're giving you an example of how that would work, how we do it, and let the customer imagine that actually happening to them and put themselves in that story. With all of these said, we want to also make sure that we don't overuse storytelling. So if you've got, like I said, it's a great thing if you can come up with one main story that you're weaving throughout. If you have a different story for every single response to a proposal, one, you're going to be in trouble for page limit because that's a lot of extra words that you're putting in there that might end up being more of fluff. But also, where our goal with storytelling is to be memorable and repeatable and something that sticks in their mind. If you've got too many stories, then they're not going to remember any of them. So making sure that you're figuring out what is the most impactful, compelling story, focusing on that one, weaving it throughout, is really what's going to be most impactful in your proposal writing.
Perfect. Thank you, Paige. So Sam, before we get to your next topic, I wanted to ask you a question that came in. Who is the hero of the story? Is it our team or is it the customer?
Oh, that's a great one. A lot of times people in sales or people who are delivering a project think we're the hero, we fixed it. But the best thing we can do is make the customer the hero. We should play the role of a mentor, or in some cases I say we are the tormentor, whereas we should never really feel that we are the heroes. We really are the people in the back room. We don't want the glory. We just want to go away with a smile and satisfaction that somebody got the accolade, somebody got the credit for fixing this issue. So at every given point, the customer is is the hero.
Excellent, thank you. So can you tell us how to apply storytelling to our business development activities?
Yes, sure. So it varies as per the customer, and of course, we must also understand that the whole competitive landscape makes it much harder. And you think back on an experience of when a salesperson really helped versus trying to sell. So the first thing in business development is actually not to try and sell, but to be able to talk to people in a way that they could relate to it and look at them directly. Maybe the 3 or 4 second rule, look at them for 3 or 4 seconds and then see that they're getting that. When this is when we have a presentation or we're in a room. But a few things we need to bear in mind is that if they got our written work, would it grab their attention? Is it got good colors? Do the main points stick out? Are the theme statements telling them really this is worth having? One way in which I've often prepared for a story is to use what I call the Prosecco approach, you know, the Italian drink, which is equivalent to champagne, but not as good. So the P stands for problem. Do we understand the customer's problem? R is, do we understand the reasons for the problem? O is, what's the outcome the customer is looking for? S is our solution to help solve that problem. E is our experience, and CO is for the competition. And often I start by relating a success story by a job role, even if it's a success story in the proposal or the exec summary, is to start by a job role. A CEO of a tech company said they were losing market share because their win rates had gone down. That's a good start. And then we explain the problem, explain what they were looking for as an outcome. They wanted to achieve a win rate of 85% because they didn't want to waste time and effort. And then we explain how we helped them and get to the results. And the results was they managed to achieve 78% within 3 years, or within 6 months, or within 9 months. That makes it much more personal to the reader because they would relate to it as per the role rather than leave it very generic. There are some terminologies that we have, such as OTAs, FedSim. Brad will expand a bit more on that. But for us, we need to go and think about it. Now, an interesting metric is for every minute that we have to interact with a customer, we need to put in something like 4 minutes of prep time. And often it's the other way around. We do less prep. So the more prep we make, the more preparation we make, the more we think about the audience, what the issues are, similar organizations, what kind of questions they may ask. And here's one that I do pretty often, and I help people when we train people becoming salespeople. Visualize yourself having that conversation with a customer. Visualize the customer's reaction. Visualize the customer asking the question. Visualize the customer raising an objection. Visualize the customer asking their subject matter expert, hey, do you agree with what Sam says? Visualize that after your prep or as part of your prep. And then when you go into a business development situation, the confidence level you would have is just immense.
Thank you, Sam. That is excellent. So, Brad, it sounds like we need to know our customer. How do we do that?
Yeah, and Sam, thank you for those examples and those pointers. And you know, there are various places in proposals specifically where we can really leverage and weave in these stories. But yeah, as far as our customer, Mallory, and the competitive landscape that Sam mentioned, I know we have a lot of people on the webinar that are selling to the government. And so these could be topics in and of themselves, but a couple of non-traditional, so to speak, customers in the U.S. government market, we need to be aware. We need to be aware how our customers buying and what vehicle, what agency we're dealing with. So one example of that, it's been around for a while, but there's a group within the GSA in the U.S. federal government called FedSim. FedSim is a client support center within GSA office to assist with acquisition services. So the trend is up. There are more and more FedSim procurements coming out in the U.S. government than there have been in the past. And you can see all of the different agencies that are putting forward FedSim acquisitions. And so if your organization, your company is selling into the U.S. federal government and you're not familiar with FedSim, all we're saying is we encourage you to do that, because this requires much more storytelling. That's the whole reason that's part of this webinar, is this is a different type of response. There are videos. We have to get good at scripting. We have to create a storyline. A FedSim procurement is very, very different than your standard traditional FAR response. So be familiar with that, and it absolutely relates to what we're talking about today. We have to tell our story if we're seeking FedSim work from the U.S. government. So this is just a screenshot really from their website. So they have all these tools available to help you understand what FedSim is all about. Right now at Shipley, we're supporting 2 or 3 client FedSim proposals, and it almost without exception, there's an orals component, a presentations component, and almost always a video component to that. So it's very unique. Another trend, all right, is what is known in the U.S. government sales as OTA, other transactional authority type bids. So this is a way the government, a lot of innovation, a lot of technology, some research type programs are being awarded now through OTAs, other transactional authorities. And here I've just cut out a couple of headlines from some article. The Marine Corps System Command harnesses OTAs for a new handheld system. Here's another one, DISA, an agency moving forward with OTA contracts. And so again, if we're competing in the U.S. federal government space, storytelling is becoming a really, really important way of, for lack of a better term, selling and proposing. In fact, it's becoming mandatory. So be on the alert, know your customer, know the competitive landscape and the environment that we're bidding in, and everything we're talking about here today, as far as being compelling, being concise, being on point, being relevant with our past performance, our experience, our stories. It really is becoming, Mallory, much more important.
Good to know. Thank you. So when we respond to those OTAs, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so here's just a couple of points. So if you're in this space and there's a innovative OTA procurement acquisition being put out there, we have to make our response very compelling and tell the story. So most likely, it's still going to be competitive, as you see here. We're still going to have to compete, which means doing what Sam said, know our customer, know their needs, be relevant. We've got to be competitively priced. And then very common in OTAs is it's more of a white paper format than what we might be used to as a regular proposal response. So again, we've got to emphasize our selling points. We've got to be a little more creative than we have in the past, and sometimes in a lot of federal government proposals now, as you all know, low price wins the day. Low price technically acceptable. And it's kind of hard to, quote, tell a story if the government's going to make their award just based on low price, although we still need to tell the story. But in an OTA environment, it's more the best story wins and not necessarily the low price wins. So here's an example where being good at messaging, telling the story really does matter.
Excellent, thank you. So the art of storytelling using graphics and captions. I'll go over this relatively quickly, but going back to those cave paintings. I mean, some of the very first stories ever recorded were recorded with graphics. So keep that in mind. I mean, when we are trying to capture the attention of our readers, the graphics will absolutely help us do that. I'm sure you've all heard the funny phrase, how can you read this? There are no pictures in it. So pictures can absolutely help with this, and especially in telling success stories. And storytelling with success stories is excellent. So you want to insert that graphic to gain attention, and then you want to state the customer's need. After that, indicate why the customer selected you, and then indicate the solution you delivered and the resulting benefit. So this next slide will kind of show how all of these pieces fit together. So here we have a graphic and an action caption. So as storytellers and as writers, I think sometimes we mainly focus on the words. So, you know, this action caption is a great place to put a very concise and succinct story into what this is, and combined with a graphic, it's very powerful. So we're inserting that graphic, like number one said, to gain the attention. Two, we're stating the customer's needs. Golf R Us needed a CRM system that included marketing automation tools. We're being very specific, but we're stating the need of one of our past customers. And then 3 and 4 show us why the customer actually chose us. Vibrant's global CRM system, or by implementing Vibrant's global CRM system, same-store lead conversion doubled in the first 8 months of implementation. So this can, you know, depending on what that customer's hot buttons were, they doubled their lead conversion. And that gave us a very powerful success story, especially if the current customer we're selling to needs to quickly build their sales or something to that effect.
Mallory, this is just, let me, if you don't mind, interject. A place where this is really, really effective is in the executive summary.
Yes.
You know, a lot of times we talk about a best practice for an executive summary is to have a key graphic. You know, whether it's 2 pages, 3 pages, whatever it is, but there's a key graphic in the executive summary, and I think you've hit on a main point. With a key graphic and a good caption, we can tell a pretty compelling story, and it can be a success story. So it not only tells our story, our solution, but it validates it.
Absolutely.
Right? Because you're saying we did this with a similar company.
Exactly.
That's a great point.
And especially like we mentioned earlier, an evaluator may not be reading the whole proposal. So if you can tell a good story in your action caption with your graphic, that can be a tremendous selling point.
Great.
So we have told you a lot about what storytelling is. Now we're going to tell you one simple way to tell a story in your proposal through theme statements. So Brad, could you run us through a simple formula for theme statements and how to do this?
Yeah, just very simply, and we've actually expressed this in some past webinars, but you showed us a great way with the graphic. Another way and another place in our documentation, whether it's a white paper, a briefing, a proposal, an RFI response, is through, like Mallory said, theme statements. So if we're tasked with developing a theme statement, some of you have seen this before, there's a very simple formula we try to follow. We put the customer first. This is a statement, a written statement going in a document or a briefing. Or the customer first. What are our benefits to that customer? what feature, what are we selling? If we can, what's the discriminator of our feature? What makes us important to the customer and unique? And then if we can fit in a proof statement, validation statement into that theme statement, all the better. So here's an example for what it's worth. All right. So this Outdoor Sports Global is the customer in this theme statement. They will reduce their cost of sales tracking and lead nurturing campaigns. That's the benefit, reduce the cost. If we could go so far as to say how much will they reduce. We maybe don't have that. By what? Implementing our feature, our solution, and we're telling them, again, a quantified benefit. This is just a bare bones basic theme statement, but if we follow this formula, we have kind of told a story, or we have reinforced our win theme, our overarching story, through what we call prime real estate, a theme statement. So Mallory, you talked about action captions. Here's another just very valuable place where that storytelling comes into play. So every major section of a proposal or a white paper or an RFI response should have a quality theme statement. And then if we want to ask ourselves, is it a quality theme statement? Is it worthwhile? Just ask this as a litmus test. Does our theme statement tell or support our story, and would it justify a high score for the evaluator? Could an evaluator look at that theme statement and say, that's worth a high score with the follow-on data? So there's a little bit of a tip on a place to use stories to help.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we talked about a lot of different things, and we did have a question come in. And Sam, I would love for you to answer this if you would. How do we help reviewers understand the value of our stories?
Oh, that's a great question. Recently, I was with some folks where they were complaining about the reviewers. So I said, what kind of questions do the reviewers ask? And they said, well, one of the first things we get is the meat is missing in the sandwich. The punch is not coming through. The proposal doesn't sound customer friendly. And I said, did the reviewer read the RFP or the RFI? No, they're too busy. They don't have time. So what we suggested there is to use that Prosecco model, is set the context for the reviewer. They're busy people, and if they've not read the RFP, is to really have a précis which says, what is the customer's problem? Why? The reasons they have this problem. What is the reason they have this problem? And what is the outcome they're looking for? Are they looking at an increase? Are they looking at a cost decrease? And may even be, who are the key players who are looking for that outcome? What's our solution, and how would they achieve those results by when? What's our experience, and what's our competition offering where we are better than the competition? If we could use that to brief the reviewers and ask them, look, we need your help for us to write a better proposal, and here's the context in which we want you to review. We see that the reviewers then give us much more constructive feedback, because half the time the reviewers are so busy and don't want to admit they don't know what to give us. So by helping them have the context of what we want them to review and give us a feedback would help make their job easier.
Excellent, thank you, Sam. So Paige, I'm going to pose the same question to you. Do you have anything to add?
I think that Sam did a good job of explaining. I think that I was just nodding my head as he was talking, so I don't really have much to add other than I agree with that.
Excellent.
Yeah, Mallory, and I would just add, and it complements what Sam said. Too many times reviewers are just in the weeds looking at technical.
Absolutely.
Because they're technical SMEs, they're subject matter experts. And so it's our responsibility as business developers to, like Sam said, make sure they understand what value we're trying to bring here, so they're reviewing for that and not just the technical. Yes, we need technical reviewers to laser focus on compliance and technical accuracy, but they also need to be following the story.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so to summarize, make sure you know your customer. We cannot stress this enough. If you know your customer, you can write a better story that makes them the hero. Make sure you are credible. Have accurate information in your proposal and in your stories. Don't fabricate them. Don't overuse storytelling like Paige talked about. Too many stories just clutters everything. Make sure you're relevant. Tell the relevant story. And be prepared. So again, know your customer, your competitors, and your value proposition. Thank you so much for joining us. These are our upcoming webinars for the remainder of the year. We hope you will join us again. And also thank you, Paige and Sam and Brad, for joining me today and talking about storytelling. We hope this was helpful for you. And also this presentation will be posted on our website by tomorrow, including the slides. So thank you. Here are our email address. If you have further questions, we're happy to answer those for you. Thank you for joining us.
Mallory, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mallory.
Thank you.